On a cold Bavarian night in early spring, long before the world knew the name Hinterkaifeck, something was already watching from the edge of the forest. It listened to the wind move through the pine trees and counted the quiet breaths of a family that believed it was alone. And that belief, so fragile and so human, would become the foundation of one of history's most haunting unsolved mysteries. This story doesn't begin with a crime, but with silence. A kind of deep, isolating silence that settles over a remote homestead and convinces those who live there that nothing beyond their fences truly exists. Andreas Gruber grew up in rural Germany when life followed strict, unwritten rules. His world was shaped by the soil, the seasons, and the necessity of survival. His childhood was forged not by comfort, but by discipline. He learned early that emotion was a weakness and control was everything, a belief reinforced by a world that rewarded obedience and punished deviation. His education was modest, just enough to read, count, and manage land. But he carried himself with the certainty of a man who believed authority was more important than knowledge. This belief followed him into adulthood as he took over the family farm, married, and built a life that from a distance appeared stable. Up close, however, it felt tightly sealed, like a room with no windows. His daughter, Victoria, grew up under this weight. Her childhood was defined by isolation rather than innocence, educated just enough to function, but never enough to escape. While the farm provided food and structure, it also created an invisible boundary between the family and the outside world. Over time, that privacy curdled into secrecy, and secrecy into suspicion, yet no one spoke of it. Rural communities often survive by looking away, by trusting that what happens behind closed doors belongs there. Hinterkaifeck itself wasn't a village but a lone homestead, separated by distance and habit. Here, days blended into one another, and nights felt longer than they should. For Andreas, farming wasn't a profession. It was his identity. His life was ruled by routine, control, and a self-reliance that bordered on paranoia. And that paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. In the months leading up to the mystery, strange things began to happen. Subtle things at first, like footprints appearing in fresh snow, leading toward the farm, but never away. It was a detail easy to dismiss, until it happened again and again, quietly challenging logic. Keys vanished and reappeared. Tools were misplaced. Unfamiliar sounds echoed from the attic sounds Andreas noticed, but chose not to investigate deeply. Perhaps because investigating meant admitting he wasn't in control, and vulnerability was something he refused to accept. Victoria, now an adult, lived a life shaped by expectation, not choice. Her prospects were limited, her role defined by duty to her family and the land. Though she had once stepped into the wider world, working away from the farm, she was pulled back by responsibility. She brought a child with her, whose presence added warmth to the household, but also intensified its isolation. The farm was never designed for growth, only preservation. The family's world grew smaller, shrinking to the boundaries of their property. And yet, despite this isolation, or maybe because of it, someone else seemed intimately aware of their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. Someone was watching without being seen, learning without being noticed. This unseen observer is the most important figure in the Hinterkaifeck mystery, defined not by a name or a face, but by sheer patience. Whatever happened here did not occur in a moment of passion, but unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if guided by familiarity rather than impulse. The final weeks were filled with small warnings that, in hindsight, feel painfully obvious. A newspaper arrived that no one had subscribed to. The livestock acted strangely. Doors were found unlocked without explanation. But each sign was absorbed into daily life and rationalized away. We have a remarkable ability to normalize the abnormal when admitting the truth would require action, and action would disrupt our routine. Their lives and responsibilities anchored them too deeply to the land, to even consider leaving it. And so, Hinterkaifeck remained standing, quiet, breathing, waiting. Meanwhile, the unseen presence grew bolder, moving closer, becoming part of the rhythm of the farm itself. The boundary between resident and intruder blurred entirely, creating a chilling question that still echoes today. Was the killer an outsider who studied the family from afar, or someone whose life was already woven into theirs? Someone shaped by the same soil, the same rules, the same silence? As we close this first chapter, the farm stands untouched by discovery. The family is, in the eyes of the world, still alive. And the killer, unnamed, unseen, and terrifyingly patient, has already crossed the threshold. Not with force, but with familiarity, setting the stage for a mystery that would outlive everyone involved. Join us next time as we uncover what was found inside. Thanks for watching. The first sign that something at Hinterkaifeck was deeply wrong didn't arrive with noise or chaos, but with an unsettling calm. It was a stillness so unnatural that it pressed against your chest, like a held breath. By the time our story moves into its second act, the farm was no longer just isolated. It was being lived in by something other than the family. The most terrifying part? No one could say exactly when that transition occurred. Days passed with routines intact. Animals were fed, meals were prepared, work was done. Yet, woven through these ordinary actions was the faint awareness that someone else understood the rhythm of the place just as well as its owners. This kind of knowledge doesn't come from a chance encounter. It comes from observation over time, a kind of apprenticeship in secrecy. Andreas Gruber, whose childhood had taught him to trust his instincts over outside advice, noticed these disturbances more clearly than anyone else. Yet, his response wasn't fear, but irritation. Acknowledging fear would mean admitting a loss of control, and control was the central pillar of his identity. So when he heard movements above the ceiling, or found signs that suggested someone had been inside the house, he treated them as inconveniences, not warnings. He chose to investigate alone rather than seek help, a decision that, shaped by a lifetime of self-reliance, would later feel tragically symbolic of the family's fate. Victoria, meanwhile, sensed a different kind of unease. It wasn't rooted in authority, but in intuition. The feeling that the space around her had become crowded despite appearing empty. Though her education had never given her the language to articulate psychological fear, she felt it nonetheless, especially in those quiet moments when the farm seemed to listen back. But her lifestyle allowed no room for escape. Her career options were non-existent, her responsibilities binding her tightly to the land. And so she stayed, adjusting to the discomfort the way people often do when leaving feels impossible. The children, too young to understand danger, moved freely through spaces that may have already been compromised, unaware that familiarity can be the greatest disguise. This is where the mystery deepens. The Hinterkaifeck Killer didn't behave like a stranger. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear moments of confrontation. Instead, there was the disturbing impression of coexistence, as if the farm had become shared territory. A place where one presence remained visible and another remained hidden. This hidden presence displayed an unsettling patience, suggesting not desperation or impulse, but cold, calculated intention. Andreas's career as a farmer required early mornings and late nights patterns that would have been easy for anyone watching to learn. His lifestyle was predictable, repetitive, isolated. It created the perfect environment for someone seeking invisibility. No one expected visitors and no one monitored absence. When a new maid left suddenly, disturbed by what she described only as something not right, her words should have broken the spell of normalcy. But they didn't. Warnings are only effective when people are willing to hear them. The family, bound by habit and pride, dismissed her departure as weakness rather than insight. Their education hadn't taught them to recognize psychological danger, only physical hardship. And so the signs continued to accumulate like quiet snow, each individual trace easy to overlook, but together forming a path that led directly into the heart of the mystery. Neighbors later recalled moments that now feel heavy with meaning casual conversations where Andreas mentioned strange happenings without urgency, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a potential threat. This casualness suggests something crucial about the killer's presence, that it had become normalized, absorbed into daily life until it no longer registered as abnormal. This raises one of the most chilling questions of the entire case. Was the killer already living among them, not just physically but psychologically, embedded so deeply into their routine that his existence felt almost expected? As winter faded into early spring, the farm became quieter, not livelier. This silence felt heavier, more deliberate, as if the land itself was holding back. It's here that the idea of an end begins to form, not as a sudden event, but as an approaching certainty, something moving steadily closer while remaining unseen. Andreas continued to manage the farm with rigid consistency, unaware that consistency itself had become a vulnerability. Victoria continued to care for her children with devotion, unaware that devotion can sometimes anchor people to places they should leave. And the killer, whoever he was, continued to observe, to wait, to exist within the margins of their lives, turning patience into a weapon more powerful than force. When communication with the outside world began to falter, when days passed without interaction, and no one immediately noticed, it exposed a final flaw in the family's lifestyle. The discovery at Hinterkaifeck wasn't a sudden, shocking event. It unfolded slowly, like a door creaking open into a room where the air just feels wrong. Concern eventually replaced routine, and when people finally approached the farm, what unsettled them most wasn't what they saw, but what they sensed. A stillness too complete, too perfect for ordinary life. This profound quiet marked the moment the story shifted from simple unease to an enduring, chilling mystery. The family had been isolated, so their absence from daily life wasn't immediately alarming, but it stretched on, raising questions. When neighbors and acquaintances finally stepped onto the property, they found a place that was eerily maintained. The animals were fed, tools were neatly arranged, and the doors were closed but not locked. It was as if life had continued its normal rhythm, just without the people who were supposed to be there. This contradiction is the emotional core of the case. It suggested a farm operating on memory rather than intention, a routine without life. The patriarch Andreas Gruber was known for his rigid sense of order, and that order seemed to linger in the very environment, even though he was nowhere to be found. His daughter Victoria's careful attention to the household was evident in every small detail, creating the unsettling feeling that she might walk back in at any moment. This feeling made their absence feel louder and more profound than any violent disruption ever could. Investigators would later struggle with this atmosphere. Traditional logic relies on disruption, on signs of a struggle or chaos. Hinterkaifeck offered neither. Instead, it presented a puzzle built on perfect normality, on the horrifying idea that whatever happened, it fit so seamlessly into the farm as daily rhythm that it left no obvious tear in the fabric of their lives. The investigators' education and experience gave them no clear framework to interpret such a scene. This lack of clarity allowed speculation to flourish, focusing not just on what happened, but on who could have existed in this space without being detected. This is where the killer's identity becomes more elusive, not more defined. Every theory seems both plausible and completely insufficient at the same time. Andreas's strict personality and his history of conflicts invited scrutiny. Was it possible the threat had always been close, rooted in personal relationships rather than a random intrusion? Victoria's life, shaped by limited options and private struggles, added layers of complexity that resisted any simple explanation. And the children's presence only deepened the tragedy without clarifying the mystery. Innocence leaves no motive behind, only questions. The killer's behavior, inferred from what was left undisturbed, suggested a deep familiarity with the farm's layout and routines. They understood which spaces would draw attention and which would go unnoticed. This implies not just observation, but comfort, a sense of belonging that challenges the idea of an external attacker. And yet, no definitive evidence ever emerged to confirm an internal one, leaving investigators suspended between possibilities. The notion that someone could remain on the property, moving freely, maintaining the farm's routines, and then vanish without a trace, stretches the limits of logic. But Hinterkaifeck has always resisted logic. It replaced it with atmosphere, with the haunting sense that the farm itself had become a participant in the mystery, preserving secrets within its very walls. The investigative methods of the time were ill-equipped to handle a case defined more by absence and by presence. This led to conclusions built on intuition rather than proof. As rumors spread, the story grew darker in the public imagination, transforming from a local tragedy into a national symbol of fear rooted in familiarity, the fear that danger doesn't always arrive from the outside, but can emerge from within the spaces we trust the most. Neighbors replayed their memories, reinterpreting casual remarks through the grim lens of hindsight. But each new interpretation only deepened the uncertainty, as memory itself becomes unreliable when shaped by shock and speculation. The killer's lifestyle, whatever it may have been, seemed to mirror the family's in its patience and restraint. It suggests a personality shaped by similar conditions, perhaps someone raised in comparable isolation, educated just enough to navigate society while remaining emotionally detached, and capable of blending into a routine so completely that detection became impossible. This chilling resemblance between victim and perpetrator is what gives the Hinterkaifeck mystery its enduring power. It collapses the distance between us and them, between safety and threat. As authorities eventually closed the investigation without resolution, the farm's physical presence began to fade, dismantled, and erased from the landscape. But its psychological presence only grew stronger. Unresolved stories don't just disappear. They migrate, settling into our collective memory, where they continue to ask questions long after the evidence has vanished. The story ends not with answers, but with a tightening circle around an idea, that the truth of Hinterkaifeck may never be found in documents or testimony, but in understanding the environment that allowed such a mystery to form. An environment of discipline, isolation, and an ending that resists closure, leaving behind a silence that feels less like an absence and more like something deliberately left in place. The story of Hinterkaifeck doesn't conclude with a revelation. It ends with a lingering echo. When the farm was finally torn down and the land reclaimed by time, the mystery didn't disappear. It simply changed its form, moving from a physical crime scene into our collective memory, where it continues to exist unresolved. This transition is key to understanding why, a century later, this case still haunts us. Andreas Gruber's life, shaped by a childhood that valued control over connection and authority over openness, ended without explanation. His legacy isn't defined by what he achieved as a farmer, but by a simple truth he failed to recognize. Self-reliance can become isolation, and isolation can become invisibility. His daughter, Victoria, had a life marked by limited education and constrained choices. Her story reflects the quiet tragedies that unfold when people are bound too tightly to a place and its expectations, unable to imagine an escape even when unease becomes unbearable. But it's the children, Chazelia and Joseph, whose lives were erased before they could truly begin, that represent the most haunting aspect of Hinterkaifeck. The tragedy isn't just what happened to them, but what never could. All their potential futures, all their choices, were stolen before they could even be imagined. This sense of stolen possibility gives the mystery its profound emotional weight. As for the killer, they remain a phantom. Not because we lack theories, but because no single theory can fully capture the unsettling reality of Hinterkaifeck. The case suggests that the most dangerous threats aren't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes they are patient, familiar, and exist right on the edges of ordinary life. They might be shaped by the same hardships and the same silences as the people they harm. This idea is far more disturbing than any single explanation, because it implies the conditions that allowed this to happen were unique but universal. They can exist anywhere isolation replaces communication and routine replaces awareness. Investigations ended, records aged, and witnesses passed away. Yet the story refused to close. It was never just about identifying a person. It was about confronting a way of life that made such an event possible. A system where childhoods discouraged emotional expression, education prioritized survival over understanding, and lifestyles discouraged outside involvement. This created an environment where warning signs could exist in plain sight and still be ignored. The end of Hinterkaifeck, therefore, isn't marked by justice or clarity, but by reflection. It forces each of us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own assumptions of safety, our tendency to normalize discomfort, and our reluctance to disrupt routine. And this is where the true moral of the story emerges. When silence becomes a habit and isolation becomes a point of pride, danger no longer needs to break in. It can simply wait to be welcomed. When communities choose not to look too closely at what happens behind closed doors, they aren't preserving peace. They're just postponing a reckoning. The Hinterkaifeck killer was never caught, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary enough to disappear into the background. They vanished into the assumption that familiarity equals safety. And this is the true, chilling end of the story. Evil doesn't always announce itself with chaos and noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, learns your schedule, shares your space, and leaves without ever showing its face. It reminds us that awareness isn't paranoia, communication isn't weakness, and asking for help is not a failure. The real mystery of Hinterkaifeck is not who committed the act, but how long the danger was allowed to fester, unnoticed. The moral that lingers long after the farm is gone is this: isolation may protect you from the world, but it can also hide the world from you. And in that hidden space, the greatest dangers are often the ones that feel the most familiar. Thanks for watching. The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at Join Criminology, and step deeper into the dark with us.